Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanalayam. Namaskaram, Vanakkam. So, I've been asked to talk to you in English. I have no issue talking to you in English, but I find it very awkward to do it here in Jaffna. So, what I've been asked to talk to you about is Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharishi's teaching and what is so special about Bhagavan Ramana Maharishi's teaching is that the famous inquiry, which is, who am I? If you say it in Tamil, Naan Yar. So the inquiry about who am I? Then people might ask, what is so special about it? And why is this inquiry about who am I? Don't I know who am I? As if I don't know who am I, and now somebody is coming and asking me to inquire about it. And if that is not enough, then here we've been asked to come on a Thursday. And there is this man sitting in his orange robes, talking about who am I, as if we don't know who we are. So, all of us have some idea as to who we are, don't we? If somebody comes and asks you, who are you? You never say, I don't know. You never say that. Definitely you will come out with an answer. So then if you think you know who you are, then what is this talk about, this inquiry about who am I? So let's talk about that today. Who is this? What is this inquiry about who am I? The interesting part is, first thing is, let's try to understand a word, identity. All of us are very familiar with, especially in Jaffna and Sri Lanka, we are familiar with the identity card. Wherever we go, we carry that. It's a security requirement. So we have an identity card. And we do have an identity. We have a name. And definitely in the identity card, you put a face, there's a picture, and we use that as an identity card. And this ID plays an important role in transacting. Let's say you go to bank, when you want to open an account, you have to submit some form of identity card or driver's license or passport or whatever it is. So you have to offer that to prove who you are. Interesting part is, you have opened the account. The next time you go to transact there, let's say you open the account and you deposited some money. Next time when you go to withdraw that money, if you go with a different ID, what will happen? Definitely you will not be able to withdraw your money. You have to take the same identity. Let's say if your ID details have changed, let's say if your name has changed, or if you have changed the photograph or something like that, not only you won't be able to withdraw your money, but you will be in all sorts of trouble. Is it? So, see, look at it, that transaction, where a need to maintain a constant ID, isn't it? You have to prove that you are the same person who opened the account, who is trying to withdraw the money. So the need to maintain that ID constant is a requirement, isn't it? So if the ID changes, you have a problem. Let's say you took but your ID is very old and now your appearance has changed. Though you know for sure that it is you, the bank official will refuse to pay because even your face has changed or your signature has changed. So that in order to complete the transaction, throughout the transaction, that is from the time you open the account till you complete all your transaction, the need to maintain the same ID is an important thing. Do we understand that? We know what is an ID and need to maintain the same ID to ensure that your transaction goes through. So similarly, in this world, not only in the bank, we do so many transactions. When I say transactions, not only paying money and getting something, or every dealing. When we deal with people, each dealing you can call it a transaction. So in each transaction, you maintain your ID. This is what you are. And with that identity, you transact with the world. So far, so good. Now, the interesting part is, let's try to understand the ID, what we use now. Instead, I'm not talking about the NIC, the identity, what we use. So we have a name. Definitely, we'll have a face for that and all of that. And I say, I'm so and so, this is my age, this is where I live, etc. And so is my father, so is my mother, this is my wife, and these are my children. All of these are all part of your ID. The interesting part is, if you analyze it very carefully, all of these things, what you say, is part of your ID. How you look, your age, etc., changes. Doesn't it change? So you say your name will not change. I agree. But again, let's talk about that also. Some relationships may not change. Who your father is may not change. Let's talk about that also. But your wife might change if you divorce. Okay. So even those part of your ID, the place where you live, you say permanent address. But then again, you decide to sell your house and go somewhere else. So the address changes. So if you look at it, most of the things what we use as ID changes. Interestingly, all of us believe in what? Rebirth. Don't we? That once you give up this body, when you die, I don't want to use the word die, okay? When you give up this body, then you go on to take another birth. Now, in that birth, your father will be not the same person, isn't it? Even if you didn't divorce in this life, in next life, the idea of the wife is different, isn't it? So then the name also will be different, isn't it? You can't say, no, in my previous birth, this is the name I had, and I want to have the same name in this birth also. So name also is going to change. So everything what you use as your identity is what? It's not constant. We think it's constant. For a short while, it will be constant. But it is going to change. It changes, isn't it? But we think it is constant. And most of the time, the short while during which it remains constant is okay for us. But at times, it changes and we don't recognize the change. And because of that, we suffer in this world. We assume that it is remaining the same, but it changes. And because we assume it is same, and because it changes, the conflict there, the contradiction there causes suffering. Let me illustrate it with an example. Today morning, breakfast, Amma offered me upuma. So I ate it. I said, oh, she asked me, how is it? I said, it's tasty. So can I serve you second time? That's okay, sir. I ate. Well, was it today morning or night? So now she found out that I like upuma. So that's not Swami likes upuma. That's part of Swami's ID now. Now this Amma, Swami likes upuma. If she tries to give me upuma for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, and next day breakfast, lunch, dinner, and if she does, if I'm going to stay here, I'm just saying for example, I'm not going to stay here that long, and don't try to give me like that also. Okay. So if I stay here for about 5 or 6 days, and if she gives me continuously upama for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and in between, if I ask for snacks also, if she comes and offers me upama, what do you think will happen to me? So earlier I said I like it. Now I don't like it. But she doesn't know that. My ideas, part of my ideas, likes and dislikes also part of me, no? Isn't it? When I say I am so and so, I like this, I don't like this, it's part of me. But it changes. But she doesn't know it has changed. And she's continuously giving me upuma. And that is going to annoy me. So like this, in the world also, what we assume as constant is changing. So in relationships, let's say the young people, they fall in love, they get married. And after some time, the most familiar complaint is, you are not like what you used to be anymore. Neenga mundi married pa illa. Meaning what? Change, and you are expecting, you want to deal with the same person. But the person has changed. So that means ID has, what we use as ID is changing. So the point I want to illustrate here is that what we use as ID is changing. So the question is, so it changes, so what? But we think it is constant. And we think it's constant and it is changing, and that conflict is what we face as, that contradiction and the conflict is what causes us sorrow. So if I continue to like upama, then there is no issue. No issue for me, no issue for her also. Now she is offering me, but this thing, I have started disliking this upama, right? So then after some time, I am getting annoyed, and she is also getting annoyed because he's not eating anymore. You get the point? So this is, upama is an example. In life, we don't recognize that the ID what we use to deal with doesn't remain the same. And we want to deal with what? Somebody who doesn't change. We want to deal with the ID which doesn't change. Okay? So, ideally, if you know the thing what doesn't change, you have to be established in that and then start operating in this world. So like this, for example, now you have a platform. Now this platform is floating in the water. Now can you stand steady on that? Let's say I'm giving you some to do something, but for that you need to stand steady and you need to do this with the steady hands. Now you are standing on this platform which is floating in the water. Can you do it? Can't. Why? Because of this shaking. But on the other hand, if I shift the platform to the ground, then it becomes easy to do. So the point I wanted to make is being established in trying to establish yourself and be steady using a changing ID is always going to cause us what? Issues. So the need to know the real ID. What we are using is relative ID. What we are using in the world day-to-day transaction is relative ID. So relative ID is changing constantly, and sometimes even we don't realize that it is changing. Only time when even then we don't notice that it has changed. We will feel it as sorrow when things change. If somebody else says you have changed, and you sit and argue, no, I have never changed. I am the same. We argue also, right? I am the same. But the other person will say, no, no, you have changed. So you want to prove that you are the same, but you also don't know what is same and what has changed. So here, need to know who you really are, what I call as absolute identity. The identity component which doesn't change at all. And the identity component which changes relative ID is what we use. So first we have to know that there is a thing called relative ID which is subject to change. Some of them will change every month, every day. Your age changes, date of birth may not change, but your age is going to change every day. So some of them is changing constantly, some of them will change over a lifetime, but all of them are relative ID. Then if there is a relative ID, then is there a thing called absolute ID? And what is that absolute ID? So the scriptures say, who you are, whom you say you are. I am so and so, I am a person, I am a man, I am a woman, I am so and so son, I am so and so's brother, etc., husband, wife, all of that. I am so and so's father, I am so and so's friend, I am working here. All of these is part of relative ID. Even the height, even the weight, everything is part of your relative ID. And some of them will last from birth to death. Even like the name what is given can last from birth to the death. At the birth certificate, you put the name until you die, the same name will remain. But that again you will never know. Some numerology or you change something and then you have a fancy, you want to change your name. Name also changes. So all of that is part of relative ID. However, scriptures say there is absolute ID, which you carry in and through all of this. Because for some changes to take place, there have to be a changeless substratum. So because if you can recognize a change, there is something which is not part of that change which can recognize this change. Because if you are also part of the change, you can't recognize the change. So there have to be some changeless aspect of you. To know the changes, you notice the changes in your body. You notice the changes in your mind, feelings, it comes and goes. So you are not the feeling, but the feeling comes and goes. So sometimes you are angry, you say, I'm an angry person, but you are not an angry person all the time. Anger comes and goes. The emotions come and go. So though you define your personality using these emotions, but the emotions come and go. So the one who knows these emotions coming and going has to be constantly there. So the one who knows these changes, whether it's at the physical level, whether it's at the emotional level, or whether it's at the intellectual level, all these changes are taking place. All of this what you call relative ID. So if these changes are taking place, and if you know that these are changing, then the one who knows these changes doesn't change. That is your absolute ID. So instead of imagining that you are this entity which is changing, what we use as relative ID, reverting back to your absolute ID, the changeless, who is the witness of all these changes. The changeless entity that you are, who is witnessing all these changes, which you call relative ID. Now, who am I inquiry is supposed to lead us to the answer. That is that answer. What is your absolute ID? Who you really are, which doesn't change at all under any circumstances. It doesn't change because the place changes. It doesn't change because of the time. It doesn't change because of the circumstances. It doesn't change even if you take many births. That ID, which doesn't change, which remains constant, which is absolute, leading you to that, because that is what you are. That's the purpose of this who am I inquiry. The next question is, what is the, if we understand what is this purpose of this who am I inquiry, that is to know my absolute ID. Because the only thing I know is now relative ID. So relative ID is okay to transact with the world, but mistaking the relative ID to absolute ID is causing me sorrow. I don't look at the sorrow like that. I think sorrow is because of something else. But all my sorrows are due to mistake, confusion, that regarding the relative ID as absolute ID. So the first thing is, this who am I inquiry is supposed to lead us to this absolute ID. Then the next question is, what's the benefit of that? What's the benefit of that is that if the reason for sorrow is mistaking my relative ID as absolute ID, then if you know absolute ID and if you learn to deal from absolute ID, look at everything, then there is no more sorrow. For example, I will illustrate it again. Now, because we take our relative ID very seriously, you believe that you were born and you believe that you will die. Yes or no? And definitely death is, as far as we are concerned, is not a happy event. Okay? Nobody wants to die, isn't it? Why? Because after death, you think you will become non-existent. You are no more. And nobody wants to be no more, isn't it? Now, interesting part is, if you look at the world, everybody who is born must die. So that means death is a must. You can't avoid it. And therefore, the sorrow is something which you can't avoid. That's what we think. The interesting part is, if you know your absolute ID, then you also know death is not for what? Absolute ID doesn't change. That means you remain. That means that death is no more for you. So what does it? What is born and what dies? The body is born. The body may die, but you will not die. And if you know that for sure, that you will not die, death is for the birth is for the body, and the death is for the body, but you will remain. Once you know that, after that, any sorrow related to death can't touch you. If you really understand it, then death is no more an issue for, because you know for sure that there is no death for you. Because only the body was born and the body will die. That is happen, that's natural. But then you will not die. Now, in our life, the biggest sorrow is what? Because of death. And the biggest fear is also because of death. So now, if you don't fear death, if the death doesn't bring you sorrow, now can you imagine how your life will be? But you'll be going around saying, Swami said that no more death for me. Will you be miserable, or will you become fearless, or what? See, the moment you understand your absolute ID, you become fearless. You become sorrowless. You get the point? So, the whole idea of searching for who am I is to lead us to what we want to be. What we want to be. Don't you want to be fearless? Don't you want to be fearless? Naturally. Don't you want to be deathless? Don't you want? Do you like to die? No. Nobody likes to die. When do we go to hospitals? So we want to be deathless, we want to be fearless, we want to be free from sorrows. So then Mahatmas like Ramana Maharishi, they figured out there's a way to get it. To be free from fear, to be free from sorrow, to be free from death, and that's what we want, and yet we are suffering. We want all of this, but yet we are suffering. And Ramana Maharishi is not only him, so many people, but Ramana Maharishi made it very clear that who am I inquiry leading to you finding your absolute ID will result in what you wanted. To be free from fear, to be free from sorrow, and to be free from death. So basically, this who am I inquiry is not spending money and doing that karma and this karma and all of that. This who am I inquiry is something you undertake using your mind and your intellect by asking intelligent questions. You're going to use your intelligence only. Now, the thing is, till today, maybe you have never asked, you never questioned your ID. Now you are in a position to question your ID. What we use as your ID, we understood relative. So then, at least if you understand the ID, what I am using is relative, I will not make the mistake of imagining that that is real and that is constant. So like this who am I inquiry is not going to change anything outside. Who am I inquiry is going to change the way I think, change the way I look at things, and change the way I relate to things, which eventually will lead to you realizing your absolute ID. And when you realize your absolute ID, you will become free from fear, you will become free from sorrow, and you will become free from death. This is what you want. And for this, you don't have to go anywhere. This who am I inquiry, don't ask me where you have to go. Do you have to go to Rishikesh, or do I have to go to Badrinath? Or no, you don't have to go anywhere. You can conduct this who am I inquiry wherever you are, whenever you want to, in whatever circumstances you want to. So you don't have to do anything dramatic, which you can do it in your own time, in your own places, wherever you are, and it doesn't cost you anything. So that it sounds so simple, you will not believe it. It doesn't cost anything. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to do anything dramatic. When you say all of this, and then you can become free from fear, you can become free from sorrow, you can become free from death, then people will not believe it. But that is a fact. And this is what Ramana Maharishi wanted people to understand. So that's why whenever somebody went up to him with some problem, he didn't try to solve the problem for them, because he understood that problem is not because of things are like that or the world is like that. The problem is because they haven't found out their own ID, absolute ID, and because of that they are suffering. So the question he asks is, he always direct them back to who am I inquiry. He says, to whom this question is coming. You ask and find the absolute ID. When you find the absolute ID, then nothing around you is going to change. But the way you look at it, the way you relate to it, and all of that will change so dramatically You will not be disturbed by anything. You will not suffer because of them. You will not fear them. And you will be at peace all the time, regardless of what's happening. This is what Ramana Maharishi wanted everyone to know. And that's the import of his teaching, especially this Who Am I inquiry. I think time is up. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate Om Shanti Hari Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Hari Om